Today, we're back in the Austin studio and I got to sit down with AI expert Russ Bodnyk. We dove into how Russ sees AI, machine learning, and artificial general intelligence. We also talk about some of the ethics and dangers of AI that passes the Turing test even if it isn't actually intelligent. He made some predictions around the future of self-driving cars, the future of work, and we tackle some challenges with AI-driven warfare. I also issue a deepfake challenge with a $1,000 prize. Deepfake RSnake and win money and internet infamy. AI is always a bit of a challenging topic because it dovetails into philosophy, religion, ethics, and science in a way that almost nothing else can. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Russ Bodnyk. Hello and welcome to the RSnake Show. Today I have with me Russ Bodnyk. How are you, sir?
Good. Very good. Thank you.
You made the long drive down from Dallas today, I hear?
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
How was that?
It's actually not that bad. The drive between here and Dallas is a lot closer than the distance to overseas.
You have a kind of an interesting lifestyle. You live out of a RV, is that, or a
Part
bus?
of the year I do.
Bus?
I do. So I have a couple different places, but as a scientist or a lazy computer science consultant, part of our job is to try to understand the complexity of the world around us and maybe predict things. Sometimes it's valuable.
Seems
assess
useful.
some risk. Never in my life thought I would be an RV person. Love it.
What do you love about it?
I think it's sort of my own conscious, subconscious version of Starship Enterprise, although it's probably closer to Eagle 5 from Spaceballs. In reality, our good friend, don't want to jump the gun.
Sure.
We could talk about him later. He turned me on to it years ago and actually started looking at him when I was still overseas. I came back, did the 2016 Centennial. I knew I was going to do it in a big RV and just fell in love with it. I was like, why do I have all this extra stuff?
That is pretty appealing, I'd say. You know, like shed all this stuff and just become a bit of a drifter and go wherever you want to go.
You know, drifting is an interesting, sometimes I feel like fancy cousin Eddie, but it's also, being a nomad has been in our DNA, right? Neolithic humans, we've always kind of transitioned and followed the game. And I love travel. It's like for me, travel and reading, pursuing curiosity. It's my life. I'm lucky to have it. But the green footprint and getting stuck in flights and 9/11 and pandemic really kind of took the romance.
I bet
out of travel and at least air flight. So the RV is great. I can. It's like a metaphorical and physical vehicle.
I heard the campsites were absolutely flooded. Like everyone had the same idea all the same time, and all the RV parks were just 100% capacity.
I'm lucky. I get to go I have a place in Colorado. Before that, I grew up visiting my family there. And so I go to Estes quite a bit in Rocky Mountain, and it's just long lines. And it's a balance. And we have a lot of opinions about government, right? But the national parks in the U.S. and around the world, state, federal, local parks, the management and preservation of nature to be shared is an amazing thing. But of course, you can't always predict when people are going to get out. So I'm so happy that nature is on the forefront of people's minds, but waiting in line for several hours, unless it's like midnight in Yellowstone and the buffalo come through. There's benefits. There's traffic at midnight in Yellowstone.
Yeah,
believe it or not.
I bet it is. It's the buffalo traffic.
It is.
So this is the second episode I'll be doing on AIML and ML. I would like to say that this will be my last, and I think it's going to be covered, but I know that's not true. It's just a way too deep topic, and I'll probably just keep coming back here. But you are the other person other than Charlie Burgoyne, who I'll talk about a little bit in the previous episode. We talked to him that I consider to be my closest friends who do this for a living.
Wow. Well, thanks, Robert.
Yeah.
Can I give a little awkward high five?
All right. We'll do that.
I like it.
That was quite awkward.
Got to keep it awkward. It's authentic.
That's right. So
hugging over. I'm a big hugger.
Yeah.
And it's just
well, we took care of that.
We
did. So do me a favor, and I've heard lots of different definitions of AI and ML. I would like to hear your definition of it. And if you want to do AGI as well, I'd love to hear that as well.
Sure. So it's very subjective, and it's growing ever more subjective, which isn't a bad thing. There is more discussion about the philosophy of intelligence. When you go back to like Noam Chomsky, And even just Richard Feynman, you know, I wish he was around. He's an amazing guy, a lot of interesting conversations. And the idea of how we define consciousness and intelligence as something just useful in a short period of time, I mean, it fluctuates all over the place. But I can say that the consensus-ish is whatever it is, we're still pretty far away amongst the actual scientists. Whether artificial general intelligence requires agency, whether it requires consciousness, whether it requires more interesting emergent properties, we don't know. So the definition nowadays is so challenging. But I can say that there is still, machine learning is more automated statistics, right? And so when you get to AGI, some would say that it's even more of an art form in a philosophical discussion. And it also depends where you go to school. Like I went to UT Austin, where it was still within the natural sciences. So there's philosophy and linguistics, whereas if you go to MIT, it used to be more in the computer sciences type or engineering.
So they haven't even standardized even in your own industry.
Not at all. And it kind of goes back and forth. So neural networks have been amazing, right? Yang LeCun did really cool stuff with basically artificial vision, the convolutional nets, which are just summaries of vision. And in 2012, before that, AI, neural networks, AI, machine learning, with anything doing like a more complex, stochastic, less deterministic thing, didn't exist. And then 2018 was huge for sequential natural language processing. So the definitions are now more fluid than ever, in my opinion. But it is general intelligence. People do kind of say it is like, forgive me, it's like porn. You know it and you see it. And which this is a big part of interestingness and subjectivity, which in art, which I'm a big fan of, right? Like we don't know. We really don't know. And it's such an exciting time to where you can actually talk about it. It's a topic of this field.
And people actually know what you're talking about.
Sometimes.
Do,
I'm not sure if anyone understands me. I'm pretty weird. But I try to keep it good weird. I try to keep it good weird. But even just like there's a talk show. I don't know if I'm allowed to mention other podcasts on here.
No, of course not.
It's called Machine Learning Street Talk, and it's amazing. Like Machine Learning Street Talk, the guys that run it, they just did Noam Chomsky, and they've done Yang LeCun, Yoshua Bengio. Yoshua Bengio is one of my favorite people of all time. Ken Stanley, Yoshua Bengio. Ken's a good friend of mine. Yoshua, I don't know, but I can listen to a podcast with some experts about the philosophy, the art. It's amazing times we live in. So they're really pushing the boundaries of defining. But I will say that cognitive neuroscientists, there's still very much. There's so much we don't know about what this does, right? And then the entire state space of what's out there, it is definitely more than GPT-3. GPT-3 is not AI at all.
So where do you see the future of AI and ML going? The real stuff that we have today that we're building on, where is that? Where do you see the future of it in 5-10 years? Like, will it be able to solve basically any human problem outside of, falling in love? Like where do you see that headed?
So one of the wonderful things is I think there's a lot of good that it can do. And this is, I don't publish research papers, right? I'm a lazy scientist. So I take people's ideas, prototypes, concepts, patents, and I try to help them build a prototype to test it out. And the amount of time it takes.
There's in physics, there's somebody who is more of a, deals with the theory of it, and there's the practical person who works at CERN. You're the sort of the practical person working at CERN and trying to build,
yes and no,
find the Higgs boson.
So you could actually do a bit of both nowadays, right? Easier than ever. And of course, I'm when I say ever, I'm viewing this like 2 decades in to where when I first wanted to get to the field, the type of AI that I was interested in, that would be considered AGI-ish at the time, neural networks, artificial imagination, creativity, was non-existent, right? It wasn't there. So there are so many applications. Like if you just froze the theory and you just applied it, you would have over 100, 200 years of better vaccines, closer to solving all sorts of problems, social and otherwise, environmental and otherwise. So my opinion is that there's a lot of our society is very much towards the publish or perish money kind of reward versus just taking applications to help people, existing things. So where there are...
And why is that? Is it just because people are locked in the ivory tower, or what's going on?
That is a good question. I don't know that I have the answer. And again, I was fortunate. I met Ken Stanley, UT Austin. He was a grad student. I was undergrad. Mm-hmm. And he's got a lot of wonderful material. I mean, he's just, I got to follow him around the world. Even though I skipped my PhD, I got to go meet up at conferences, and like we go have dinner, and like that person's awesome. Oh my God, that person is interesting. And so I was sort of like behind the scenes, not publishing, but still attending conferences and hanging out with Ken and just seeing his reaction. He did some work at the Complexity Institute in Santa Fe, where it's very interdisciplinary. And so they have a lot of different kind of people. So he really, whenever even he's publishing his paper, sometimes he trying to get into a conference or, whoever's going to pay him. And there's still all these gatekeepers. Like, we want something innovative, but you have to do the same old thing, right? We want something brand new. And yet we want this benchmark, right? So we're playing to the benchmarks. We're not allowing true innovation from some degree. We're not admiring true creativity. And it's something where the strong AI, if you ask like a Bengio and a lot of the people that are pushing the field, like Yang LeCun, Bengio, and others, a lot of times they won't even give a prediction, right? And they're all way better in this field than I am. And so then you have, of course, Ray Kurzweil, 2029. Mm-hmm. What do you think? Are we going to have a strong AI, AGI in 2029?
I think we'll have something that passes the Turing test.
Well, I mean, we're getting close to that, right? Depends on who it is you want to talk to. If you want to talk to a crazy teenage chatbot, GPT-3 is great. If you want, true expert system advice, maybe not so much.
I keep playing with the idea that if I just applied one of these chatbots to all of my email that I've ever received, all of my responses, it would be pretty close to how I think and how I'd respond to things. I mean, it wouldn't be perfect, and it wouldn't be able to come up with necessarily net new ideas, but it would certainly be able to respond to the bulk of questions that come my way.
Absolutely. So that's how we define, like, what do you do during your day involves agency, involves consciousness, involves intelligence. Whoa, I got to dance with the mic. I was getting away from the mic. Thank you, Mike. I'm back. Whenever we are so much of the daily tasks, the dull, mundane, et cetera, it's getting really good at. Mm-hmm. So if I may step back for a second and going back to the definition of AGI, there's a current popular theme, and I don't disagree with it, where Daniel Kahneman is a famous psychologist and economist, and he puts forth the idea of type 1 and type 2 intelligence and systems. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow years ago. Mm-hmm. And Yoshua Bengio and a lot of the researchers in the field are kind of using this out of the infinite state space of what the heck is intelligence, what are our limits, how we define it, how can we do it artificially, can we talk to the octopus or not? In that state space, it seems to be the current models of, if I may explain this, so much of this stuff, it's hard to have a discussion without also education, which can get really boring, right?
No, I mean, we'll do your best not to make it boring, but I think a lot of people will need to have a little bit of a primer. So might as well.
So, and for primers, again, Machine Learning Street Talk is an amazing series, but those guys will go deep too. So there's a lot of things they talk about where it's hard, like what are they? So what are Markov models? What do you mean by Bayesian? So type 1 intelligence is where AI is right now, and in the way that is defined, and then the way that a lot of vectorized neural network stuff. You have graphics cards, you have vectors of vectors, and even stepping back further, you could do a lot with just graph theory, like stuff I worked on with Charlie. Graph theory, graphs are amazing, right? Or practical applications, not theory necessarily. But the idea is if you do a new application, like you have this graph, in a graph, you can graphs way better. Relational databases are not good at representing relations, right?
Surprisingly.
And a graph is so wonderful because it makes sense. You can show it to an executive, you can show it to a child, depending on how old, and it's basically a giant ass flow chart. Huge, represent all the realities of flow chart as much as you can abstract. And then you have directions, arrows of causality, and then you can have weights, probabilities between two dots. The GPS that got me here today was a flow chart, right? A graph model. And so right now, what we talk about neural networks and convolutional nets and BERT, GPT-3, et cetera, those are vectorized words, right? And a coarse combinant is vectorized images. So it's vectors on vectors. There's no larger, a vector is just like an array. It's like a lists of lists with links to them. And so the idea is in type 1 intelligence, what we do, got to play with the mic, what we do in type 1 intelligence, and there's much more into it, but essentially the way we can think of it practically, like when I drove here, when I left Dallas, that I drive all the time, I'm on autopilot. I'm instinctually going. I don't have to think half a second of what to do. It's a route that I've learned. It took me a while to learn how to do it, to understand object permanence, maybe when I was 8 months old, like my hand doesn't float through as a child, to then learn how to drive, etc. But once I do it, it's fast. We don't think about it.
Right.
And current machine learning is like that. It's when we see GPT-3, that's a wonderful chatbot, like, oh my gosh, like it's like you said, it sounds legit. If depending on your task, it can take up to 95+% of your tasks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those edge cases though, whenever I'm driving and I leave my neighborhood, oh man, there was a lot of traffic today. So then bam, that's an edge case. There's a new kind of construction or something. Or something maybe I've never seen before. So then I leave that type 1 intelligence, which takes a long time to learn, but is fast, instinctual, and parallelizable. It can walk and talk, etc. Then we move to type 2, which is slow, methodical, verbalizable, conscious. We think about it. And that's kind of what people think about thinking. And there's many different forms of intelligence.
And it's a different part of your brain.
Well, it's not only that, but neural networks are both memory and processing all in one. It wires and fires together. And for a long time, we've known that really we need much more complex theoretical models. We need more complex things that we can test. We need different objective functions. Are we trying to navigate? Are we just being creative? We need better ways to have randomness that's not brute force. So there's still all these problems in information theory of consciousness and AI. So as we're going to type 2, that's where we're really far behind. Assuming that the type 1, type 2 model that so many people are into is
it seems plausible.
Yeah. Even if it's not plausible, it works well with computers.
Well, how about this? It seems like that probably is how our brain works. So if we're trying to model something that looks and acts like us, you're probably going to have to do something kind of similar.
Correct. And not only that, though, the nice thing, too, is that it conveniently kind of fits into a lot of the AI paradigms. So we've got all this sweet hardware, right, where these vectors, right, you just brute force it to a certain degree. And GPT-4 is going to be like 1 trillion parameters. So, it's going to burn like multiple rainforests worth of stuff on one hand. Yeah. On the other hand, it does amazing stuff, right? And it will be a stepping stone on my opinion, on the path towards, it'll be a branch that dies, just like we're the result of all kinds of branches of evolution. And so anyways, I hope this is not another great AI die-off. I experienced one when I started in the field. I was like, it was less fun. I don't think it's going to be. Just a lot of hype, which is a better problem than prejudice and dogma around a field. Better, at least there's just something. So this type 2 is really fascinating, and we really don't fully understand it. And then back to that kind of graph idea of, well, I've got links and nodes. Looks like a giant flow chart. Most people have used flow charts. If then else, we go different directions. And then also with the language model, what's interesting is that 2018 we had that, before 2012, neural networks just didn't work. It's like, show me, prove it to me. As a scientist, right, we have a hypothesis, and we need to try to consider is it a false positive? But we understand how is it true? Why is it true? And why and when and where is it not true? And hence the scientific method and publications. But now we can test a lot of this stuff, and it's fascinating. And for a lot of intents and purposes, like for fun, for creativity in terms of just having fun and not necessarily trying to. The creativeness that a researcher has to do is like, man, how does dementia and plaques and tangles work? Like, oh man, we're still so much about allergies we don't understand. Or
even vision.
Oh man, I used to tell my students, the 20-20-20 rule, like where every 20 minutes, make sure you pick something 20 feet, away, stare for 20 seconds.
Yep.
And then during the pandemic, I had out my phones and I'm just like, whoa, okay, I totally destroyed my vision. I'm really missing the vision I used to have.
Yeah,
I'm missing it.
Yeah.
So the type 2 where we are now. So type 1, if this is the way it works, we're thinking we've done a pretty good job.
Of type 1. Yeah, type 1 seems like a solvable problem almost.
Yeah. Well,
with today's technology, nothing crazy. Just, you give it enough tests and you give it enough feedback. You're like, you did a good job and it's great. I got a good score. So I'm not going to run over that person. That's good enough.
Well, and forgive all the car analogies, but they work so well. And Tesla is amazing engineering. OpenAI, so we live at a time too where the people are putting out this stuff for free. Like when I do a project, I've been a big fan of open source forever. And people like, can I do this? Can I do that? And I was like, my job is, first of all, that's in the movies. That doesn't exist. You know what that's like.
Yes, I do. Know all about it.
Ethics and laws, kind of important.
If Chris were in the room, he'd say yes, but if you don't do it, then no one will watch the show.
Right.
So,
so that's where it's exciting. And within the driving and that Tesla, what they do, Andrew Karpathy and others, that's some serious engineering, what they can do. And they're just doing direct compiling. They're customizing everything and squeezing the most out of their own custom hardware. And so it's going to be fascinating. You have that type 1 is really good. You have brute force approaches like GPT-3, GPT-4. They're working better than we thought. It's not intelligence. It's not consciousness. It's not agency. But that type 1, type 2, if that's what the case is, we're getting darn good at type 1. But we still are terrible with edge cases and learning. Like, you don't have to see 1,000 images of a banana to recognize a banana. Or hot dog. Have you seen Silicon Valley?
Not hot dog.
Hot dog, not hot dog. No hug. We'll do long distance high five. I love that. What do you think about that show, if I may ask?
The first episode, not having no context at all for the show, I was just turning it on. It almost gave me a panic attack because it was so realistic, and I was actually going through some very similar trials and tribulations with my company at the time. I'm like, I don't know if I can watch. I mean, I know it's a comedy, but
too close.
It was a little too close. But after a couple episodes, I really got into it, and I think it's a great show. It's very funny.
Oh, it's awesome.
Yeah.
Some of my friends worked with some of the comedians on that, and they're like legit. I love playing the Hollywood game, like my friends that are in Hollywood, who's an a-hole and who isn't. It's really interesting. Some of them are like, I could see that. Some of them are really nice.
A very good friend of mine actually writes Guilfoyle. So.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
He does such a good job.
Yeah, he does.
I wonder where he gets inspiration from. Holding up the mirror.
Yeah.
As you can tell, very quiet.
Yes.
But it's hard to answer some of these questions, right? Where, how do you have the mind meld? And it's never a simple answer, right? The more we know, the less we know. But brevity is wonderful too. And
so where do you think this is going for the average, employer or employee and the company going forward? Is this something that's going to be part and parcel to their daily operations where every single thing they have is sort of interrupted by an AI agent that does something and then they just get an output and they're like, good enough? Or is it going to be fairly specialized in only very particular industries? Like I even see it in places like human resources. Like there's a company called MindBridge, for instance. And they try to identify whether people are buying yachts and they shouldn't be buying yachts. You know what I mean? All kinds of stuff. That's not a use case that most people think about. Why would AI get involved with that? Well, if you got a lot of data, you might want to have somebody to go check all that.
Or you have Putin upsetting his yacht owners. There might be some interesting things in the market.
So there's all kinds of versions of that. I mean, certainly in my world and certainly in just IT in general, there's lots of applications. But what about, the average? Like, I really think there might be an awesome place for legal, for instance. Like, why is a lawyer sitting there all day analyzing contracts when really the bulk of contracts are just cut and paste? They're the same, 2 or 3 massive clauses over and over and over again. So why do you need to check that? Why can't the AI decide, here's the risks and tell you what the risks are, and you can just say, yep, I'm okay with those risks, not okay with these risks, or weight the risks and say, fire it back with these risks highlighted, or turned off. I'm not going to accept this contract as is. And the AI on the other side battles it back, and they decide in a weighted score of where they're going to land.
Wonderful questions, and the answer is it's already doing that to some degree. In terms of legal expert systems, because if you actually break down if you go and test GPT-3 or Hugging Face is an amazing company, and all they do is make these complex models accessible. You can go and get on the website and you can test the best models often. So you have summarization, you have question answering, you have translation, and you have substitution. You also have word generation. And if you could break down a lot of tasks with text, whether it's legal expert or otherwise, that's a large portion of most people's tasks.
But even goes beyond that. So there's a company, I don't know if they still exist. I think it was called Crystal AI, maybe. And basically you just go there and you type in someone's name and they're like, this is the kind of person they are, which seems a little like reading people's fortune or something. But the idea was they scrape your social media and they figure out, well, this person seems to be the kind of person who's more pragmatic. So you probably don't want to talk to them about, fortunes or whatever, or this person seems to be more artistic. So you probably want to talk to them in this particular way.
Well, exactly. And that's where it had the advantage. Yes, it can't handle the edge cases and creativity, but if you look at what the brain does a lot of the time, right? We're focused on reproduction. We're not always doing sophisticated things. And for that overlap, it is here today. It's a matter of the accident of who gets accepted, whether it's driven by your nation state or your personal prerogative or just chance and randomness. It's there. It's happening. I've worked on some prototypes with some of my business partners where essentially we're doing, and I like it because they're trying to they're trying to bring fancy tech to middle class and or students and or English as a second language that can't get all the great Apple. They can't afford a $1,200 phone, right? Mm-hmm. Siri's not that great anyways. You're not missing anything. So what's wonderful about it...
I'm under NDAs about Siri. So.
Oh, okay. I tell you what, Steve Jobs is an amazing man, but, just in the publication world, I have yet to see a good publication AI. Open source. I read papers. Some of my friends are publishing. I use it. I'm like, hey, someone's like, hey, can you build me a digital legal chatbot? Can you create an avatar that's 40% Oprah, 60%, Michelle Obama, sometimes a little bit of Billie Eilish? Like, yeah, sure. I could approximate the voice. I could take in the content. So I get lots of requests. And so people at Google, Facebook, they OpenAI, they snagged up a lot of the best researchers, but it's free and it's open, a lot of it. Mm-hmm. Not so much with Apple, nor other countries, right? So in some ways it's really interesting. Yes, privacy sucks. We don't know we know our FICO score, but we don't know our Facebook, Google, advertising, whatever scores are out there. And then also that we get to computational psychiatry, which I did a little bit of work in years ago. One of my friends is a badass. She's a forensic psychiatrist in New York. And back then there was very little in the field, but now Apple's been there's a lot of people filing patents. It's not just you're about to have a heart attack. It's like, oh, you're going to have a PTSD, the specific thing, warning, check in. Mm-hmm. And anyways, so absolutely it is here. It's happening. It's quietly, they're doing quiet, crazy stuff with the big government, speculating. They're doing quiet, crazy stuff with the big government. It's crazy in the sense that they have these giant treasure troves of language, Twitter, the internet. That's basically like GPT-4, 3 and 4, right? They just take
God help us.
and that's why you have to be careful. It is very
That's
good.
like computer science 101. Do not accept user input. You got to do stuff to prevent that from entering your system.
Well,
it's going to be a nightmare.
Yeah, and there's been stuff in the media.
If you accept it, make sure you parameterize it, make sure you know exactly what you're getting.
Well, that's another discussion too. We talk about stochastic state spaces and infinite things, and it's my
name is pi, and I don't mean some approximation of it. It's actually pi.
Nice. It's well, that's another interesting number too. We start getting into primes and pi, right? We don't have an AI that can understand what pi actually means. Mm-hmm. How you apply it, what's the context? Mice and mazes cannot solve prime number maze. Mm-hmm. So that's another in defining consciousness in AI, understanding our own. What are our hard limits? Are the rules to intelligence like we have rules to physics, and we don't really know, but we're getting closer, type 1. And so with the current research, there's so many jobs you could do with AI, or at least you don't have to replace someone's entire role. Like, it's 16 monitors is the CISP Security Plus says the minimum or maximum number of monitors a security guard can monitor is 16 visual monitors, right? Like we can't correlate, much like causate, more than that. And so, but with assisted AI, right, you can do much more. And that's where we are, like collaboration. I love the idea of collaborative AI, because the idea is that it's not going to take over for us for a long time, depending on what you do, right?
I think some people are going to get out of jobs very quickly.
Absolutely. The more dull, dirty, and boring your job is, and dangerous, right?
I think it's X.AI, maybe something. It's a digital assistant. And a number of people I know have switched over to it and just said, screw it. I don't need to monitor my mail coming in, asking me for meetings. Just have this digital assistant kind of handle all that stuff for me. That's definitely removing jobs, 100%.
Oh, yeah. Well, and so that's where, from an economic standpoint, definitely, it is happening. It will happen, and there will be that disruption. And that's where, I don't have the answers. I start with I'm wrong to be less wrong. If I'm a little less wrong at the end of the day, it's a good day. And, the ideas of like Star Trek, universal income, where, yes, there's all this crazy, fascinating, dangerous, wonderful healing. There's the full spectrum of what AI can do. But much like Star Trek, not everyone's going to use it. You can go have Ferengi. You can have you can worship the AI. You can be against the AI. By the way, I've always wondered in my recent travel a lot, I saw a Amish horse and buggy getting pulled over at midnight by the police for speeding in East Coast recently. I was just like, I was very curious about that. It does happen. It does happen. And I was wondering if they had the proper AI.
Wait, are they speeding or is the horse speeding?
Don't know.
Who got the ticket?
Don't know. I was like, man, they're going really fast. I assume it was speeding. I don't know for sure. But anyways.
So, okay. Well, let's switch it up a little bit. Let's talk about the future of automobiles. So one of the things I think is great about automobiles is the future of them is I can be absolutely drunk and get home. I mean, right now I've got the Uber, I can, make a phone call or whatever, but wouldn't it be great if I didn't have to talk to anybody and I just got home? I could sleep it off and I don't have to worry about getting robbed or, someone worrying about their safety or whatever. Just get in the vehicle and it takes me where I'm going, and it's way safer than an actual driver. Or the other version of that is maybe it lets me drive, but maybe it says, hey, you're drunk. You're not allowed to drive. I can tell, or you're sleepy. I can tell you're starting to nod, or I can tell you look sick. You look like you have a fever. You're probably not feeling well. I'm going to take you to a hospital, or I'm going to take you home. I'm going to take over driving. I know you love driving, but no, not today. Like, where do you see the future of cars going? Like, I keep wondering, what's the last car I'm going to have to buy?
People will miss the romance of cars.
Of course they will.
On the open road. It's going to happen. It's inevitable, I think, because it depends on the government, right? If we're talking Mars or an asteroid, so there'll be so much safer than a human eventually.
When's eventually? That's kind of what I'm getting at. And what does that mean? What is safer? I think I have an idea for what I mean by that question, but not necessarily the audience. So what does safer really mean?
So when it comes to normal driving conditions, they're pretty good. And that's where the definition of safer is not even, how it depends on the, mortality, like how many people die on the road. But what is the real cause? Like texting and driving, right? Texting and driving that's a big cause, being distracted. And so with Tesla, for example, and I just go back to them just because they are pushing the envelopes for driving, and it's just a feat of engineering. Their statistics coming out, it's the edge cases. So whenever there will be a freak accident or even just a weather storm where that particular use case was not trained on, and people will die. And so it's a matter of the history of what's happening now, how many accidents, and it's very political too, right? So the number, on average, for the average person, a Tesla is probably a better driver in certain scenarios, like on the highway. But when you are in
so
busy
for trucks, for instance, it might be the answer to long haul trucking.
And I don't know what's going to look like when you get into some crazy Boston streets and traffic. Like, it's.
But that is definitely going to put hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans out of work very, very quickly.
It's happening for sure, right? With Uber, when I spoke, this is fun. It's my first public thing, and thank you, my friend,
you're welcome
for having me here. A lot of stuff I've done talks and stuff in privately. So I was doing some government to a political crowd at the state of Texas. Very cool institution, private conference, and they're like, "Hey, man, don't mention job disruption when you talk about the future of AI." Okay, I'm doing the accent a little more so. I love accents. I love accents. I love Texas. I'm originally from New York, but I grew up in Texas. What's one of the first things I talked about on stage, right? Mm-hmm. Because everyone was asking about it. Sure. Is it going to take my job? Is it going to lose? It's everywhere. And
you think it is?
It is. I'm surprised it's not happening a little faster. Mm-hmm. I wish the whole world to have less suffering and more happiness. Repeat. The ethics ethos first when possible, right? Like, I don't want anyone to suffer, but the nature of reality is that there will be some disruption. Absolutely. We were not prepared for pandemic, which was kind of predictable, like, right?
Extremely, actually.
And in Texas, it snows, and each year people are like, "Oh my gosh," I think it snowed in the past. It might snow again, and so, without being boring and to wax and wane, this nature of humanity and philosophy, right? To underestimate and to not be able to predict, and so absolutely, it's here. And in terms of years, it'll be interesting to say maybe for highway use, less than 5. Right, the full self-driving mode. I mean, I ordered another Cybertruck. Now you can't customize it, but the full self-driving mode, right? Like, what exactly does that mean? And so many others are going to, whether we do it or not, Chinese robots are going to take people's jobs.
Sure.
And that's where I'm not a fearmonger. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt is something that I try to avoid. I have a very relaxed amygdala most of the time. So China's going to, whatever we do or don't do, someone on Mars, Russia, China, someone else will do it. And it's just a matter of time for highways, certainly for delivery truck services. What's even more interesting, I think, are the number of flying electric cars, the number of drones in the sky, Joby Aviation, Germany's Lilium, Archer. There's a lot of huge progress with that. And so the regulations...
They're not quite there yet. But
no, they're not.
They're getting really close. I remember seeing one, I can't remember which, maybe it was Archer, flying in Abu Dhabi, maybe. And they're like, fly to building. Why do you even need to think about getting in a car? Just go to the roof, jump in the quadcopter, and it takes you over. And there's no controls at all. It's like you're just in a vehicle that just takes you.
It's a big drone.
Yeah, it's a big drone. I mean, Hollywood's already experimenting with this for very large rigs, not the tiny little drones, but these are enormous, can lift an entire car type drones. And I see no reason why that can't be turned into a bus, just a big bus, get on it, takes you wherever and drops you off, and there it is.
In some ways, I jokingly, I just took my family to New York City, my niece and nephew, they loved it. Right. And then Napoleon Dynamite's like one of my favorite movies. I kind of like quote Napoleon Dynamite, Step Brothers. And when I think,
can you do the dance?
Yeah, I know, right? Oh wow, I can't do that. But sometimes like, what is AI going to do? What is Putin going to do? And a lot of that's my answer is when I ask my nephew when we're walking to Central Park, what are we going to do today? He's like, gosh, we're going to do whatever we want, and that's where it's going to proceed faster, I think, than the laws and the ethics will catch up.
So if I can hold on to my car for 5 years, you think the very next car I'll get will drive me around town and take me everywhere I want to go? And I will not have to even look at the steering wheel once. I can be on my computer the whole time.
5 to 10-ish.
Okay.
The technology will be there. It depends on your edge cases.
Just normal downtown traffic. I'm not talking about going off-road or something.
Yeah, and there'll be a lot of stats. So it'll probably be certain modes, traffic, city, in between mode. It will probably be certain areas they won't let you, like wherever it's statistically the AI just can't handle it. So it's going to be the easy cases first, the low-hanging fruit first, to where if just depends on where you're going. If you're going from like a simple warehouse to a simple warehouse, and there's not lots of crazy Bostons in between, 5 to 10 years, I think.
And how do you think about the legislation? How long is that going to take for them to catch up where I'm allowed to fully be asleep the entire time?
And it all depends on where it is. So I would maybe 10 years. It's hard to say. This is all wild ass speculation.
Of course, that's why
all
we're
wild
here.
ass speculation.
But I think it's a useful. I'm gonna put a calendar notice on my calendar 10 years from today, and I'm gonna say, Russ, you were completely right, or
probably be wrong. I tend to be off of my estimates.
But I want to know in what way though. I think that's interesting, and I think the more people I ask, the closer I get to an average. I really thought it would happen faster. I thought this was coming much, much, much quicker. But I think part of the problem is there's been so much hesitancy in the market. People like it, but people are still very afraid of it. I was driving in Oregon with a friend of mine, Seattle. I think it was Seattle, actually. And we were on this little island off the coast, and he has Tesla. And I'm like, why aren't you turning it on the auto mode? I'm just kind of curious. He's like, oh, you really can't. I'm like, what do you mean you can't? Like, it's a road. Why not? He's like, okay, I'll show you. And he turns it off, and he has his hands like he's like about to. And sure enough, we went around a turn, and it took it extremely wide to the point where I'm not sure it would have corrected in time. And I'm like, okay, I see. And he had to steer into it and take control. I think that it's going to be a while before he feels comfortable to let go of the wheel.
Right.
And now it may not have crashed. It might have just been taking a wide turn, and there's a cliff there, so I can see why he's a little freaked out by that, or maybe rightfully very freaked out by it. But it's going to be a while, I think, before it drives like people drive in a way that they just go, yep, it works perfectly all the time. Much better driver than I am. I've gotten in 3 accidents the last 3 years. This thing's never been in an accident. This baby is perfect, kind of thing.
Well, and there's certain...
And why do I even need to own that thing is the other question. Why isn't that just an Uber car that comes around and picks me up?
Oh, yeah.
And there's always a burst capacity for anyone who wants it.
Sure. And that's going to most likely happen as well. And with that, and if anyone that's watching, or if you're, it's kind of a fun edge use case. It's a little older now, but it's still relevant. There's video on the subject of the Tesla self-driving. And one of the things I like about Elon Musk and Tesla and his companies, they're open. Right, so much of the stuff that's happening, you have no idea what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like Moderna in the biotech space. Mm-hmm. I love watching their stuff. I have some of their same equipment in my lab. Other farm doesn't do it, and so with some of these big things, they're not going to tell you exactly what they're doing. They may publish a nice fancy research paper at a conference that makes them look wonderful to stockholders and the public, but they're not going to show their error cases unless they're forced to.
Sure.
Tesla does sometimes. So there's a situation where on the edge case, something I wasn't trained for, Tesla's going down the highway. This is on YouTube, actually. There's a couple videos of it on YouTube.
I think I've seen some of them.
And what it's passing, going around 70 on the highway, is a construction vehicle carrying equipment to be installed. And the equipment it's a intersection in the back of a truck. So you've got stop signs, you've got street signs, you've got stoplights. And so you can watch the AI, which is typically bounding boxes, and it shows what's going on, and it has a probability. And all of a sudden, it starts drawing all these red boxes, and it's like 70 in the highway. Am I in a intersection? Error, intersection. Do I slam on the brakes? And of course, it's got a validation routine. It checks what's going on, and so that's a wonderful.
That's a weird one.
Illustration of the use case where a human's like, yeah, deploying down, it's like, yeah, of course, that's just a regular truck, with construction equipment. I'm not going to slam on the brakes. That would be terrible. Mm-hmm. Now, it didn't slam on the brakes, but you could see where maybe a previous version did, and they didn't know about it, or it's just a chance of, state space.
So I've heard the phrase, the software is eating the world. Do you think that eventually we won't need to work? Do you think that this is going to get far enough along that you'll basically just tell an AI system, hey, I want to build blah, 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 and it'll just go and do it for you, and you can just relax at home all day or travel all day and never have to think about working?
I mean, in my opinion, humans are wonderful. The full gambit of creative, inspirational, do whatever you want, destiny, seize the day, and then they're also very dogmatic and following. So the option will be there. There'll be both. So that there will be, if you so choose to work, because for whatever reason you want to do it yourself, you feel good about it, you can do it. Again, I keep referring to Star Trek. But Gene Roddenberry, minus the strict military structure, he was a helicopter pilot. So much of Star Trek I find when I'm talking to a crowd or the general public, I'm like, think about Star Trek. They have AI, they have an option, there's a Federation, there's a meritocracy, there's the Ferengi, there's all of it. Anything is possible, but you can, if you so choose and have the prerogative to not have to work, right? And that's where it's my opinion, it's less about job displacement, the negative. It's more about, what if you could do anything you want to do? What is your dream? I try to ask people frequently. I didn't have amazing counselors growing up, at school, but whatever. I was a upper middle class kid. I was like, hey, can you help me fill out these college applications? That's all I needed. Very lucky. I'm very, very fortunate. But you don't ask people, if you could do anything, what would you do? Realistic, get a PhD in AI, be a badass world podcast host and ethical hacker, write Slow Loris and change the world. Another high five, big hug. That's so cool. And so
one of these days I'll have that conversation on the podcast. I don't think I have it yet.
Oh well, no way. But a lot of people are like, I don't know. I don't have an answer. And my hope is, they'll, of course, there's the other end, have tea with Richard Feynman, Jesus and aliens. That'd be fun. That's out there, right? Why not? My hope is with AI, it's going to be so built in that you will have that digital, you will have the resources of the presidents and the kings and queens. If you want to create a wonderful, amazing podcast like you do, anyone could do it, and so it will, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and many throughout history, have talked about technologies enabling. And I think AI can be one of the most enabling technologies that any species does, humans or otherwise. And so that's kind of the hope. It's less about job displacement, in my opinion, more about the future. And if we can prepare for it. But
the job displacement is a very important point, because
it matters for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, it matters in the short term, but in the long term, it also means that the value of everything goes to zero. Everything effectively goes to zero.
So
because no one has money anymore because they don't work.
Well, that's where, but then you get into free will, right? What do you have do you have the freedom to entertain, to Netflix yourself, reality show yourself, podcast yourself for eternity? So what is the utility? What is the point of existence in life, right? And so it's
pretty strange. I can't even imagine.
Well, and then there's another perspective too of, some people say a good life is quality time with the people you love and the places you love, talk about the things you love, and that doesn't necessarily require work. So I think it is, would we cease to go forward as a species? And I don't think so. I think, and again, this is crazy subjective. Again, could be totally wrong.
I'm holding you to it.
Yeah. Subjective.
In 1,000 years, I'm going to come back.
Opinionated. And I'm kind of a calculated optimist, and glass is half full for sure. And
the real scientist would say someone didn't complete this beaker. The experiment's not complete. We gotta.
Well, there's something I also appreciate about you and our mutual friend. And I appreciate the multiple dimensions of intelligence that you have.
Thank you.
And you don't have just the good causality. You can correlate more than 8 things. You can code, but more importantly, you have the emotional intelligence and social skill to be a cool human, to socialize, to do the show, to help people, to write, a bold, risky program that changed part of the world, and it still is to some degree, or at least variants thereof. That's amazing. Another high five, long distance hug. And you just sold your company, right? I don't know if we could talk about that or not.
If you want.
So in your life, your degree of requirements and freedom, desires, wants, beyond Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of eating and sleeping, etc. And
I need more sleep, actually.
Yeah, cool. Don't we all?
Food I could do without.
Yeah. It's I almost got you off the ground.
I didn't
want to squeeze you too much.
I know,
it's not too bad. I could have. I just
it's actually mostly muscle these days. But I could probably lay off the snacks.
I love the bear hugs, but you got to ask people oh my gosh. I have a good life, I'm lucky. I get along with much people. I was in East Coast, and I met some fun new people on the beach, and they turned out we had things in common, colleagues, and this is when I was helping someone with the computational psychiatry startup. So it was someone I respected. we just connected. We had a great dinner, and I gave him a big hug, did my bear hug thing, and they had like implants, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was a little too aggressive. So I don't do that. I try to ask and not lift all the way up. So anyways,
all right. No implants. It's all natural.
No implants, because, yes. So I think RSnake in multiple dimensions, in different versions of reality, and a lot of times reality is a giant probabilistic tree, right? You go any which way.
Yeah, it's a cloud. Yep.
And you would do something interesting in multiple versions of reality. Whether you were Universal Income Future Star Trek, where AI did what we call work in this particular time space, or not. So not to of course, I sound like a lot of the movies out there. Yeah, it's the same everywhere in the multiverse.
Well, there's something to that way of thinking, anyway. It gives people the impression that there is a course of action that could take them down different paths, and maybe they should pick the right one. Certainly. I don't think most people think that way. I think most people are just kind of on a path, and just every day is another day, and doing the grind, and I show up to work, and this is what I do, and they're not really thinking, I wonder what happens if I decide that I hate this job for reals, as opposed to just bitching about it, and go get put my resume out there.
Right. Well, I think part of that too is, as this cognitive architecture is developing, right, we start with nothing, blank slate. Well, that's another discussion around like how many semantic priors, how much instinctual intelligence stuff is built in our genetics, right? And what are the good things and the limitations. But if you catch people young enough and you ask them, here's what science is, here's what would you do? Expose them to different things. This is travel. There's these different beliefs, political parties, religions, so much of the stuff that gets super dogmatic and tribal that you can, I think, really, like when I grew up with, or I didn't grow up traveling internationally. I grew up traveling in the US, so I grew up with a love of travel. And I think about my niece and nephew and a lot of people and exposing them to things. And I'm hoping that they will see something, so that common pattern of we don't choose when and where we enter time space, when and where we're born, and we get stamped so much, right? Like language, religion, and a lot of patterns end up being partnership, marriage, kids, mortgage, job, repeat, because those are the things. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're social, we want to reproduce. But if you can get into that pattern early enough, whether it's like, what do you want your AI to upload today in your Matrix style VR headset? Or that RSnake and all his guests really inspired me when I was a kid. Like, there's maybe 4-year-olds watching your show. Hopefully not. There's a little cussing. I don't know.
A little cussing.
So I think, and again, this is calculated optimism. Probably I'm totally wrong, but I do think that side of consciousness and intelligence that we don't understand how much is built in here as an evolved, beautiful, terrible animal, mostly beautiful, will persist in a lot of situations. Obviously, once you have to get past survival, it's hard to be like, oh, well, this is the specific place. This is my bucket list. Whenever you are stuck with, pain and suffering, emotionally, PTSD and otherwise.
All right. So
Very short answers.
I realize that. It's actually good, because I think it sets a little bit of the groundwork for why I think AI in general is interesting. I think it's much more interesting than just some software. I think it's what it does and how it forces us to think about who we actually are.
Oh, absolutely.
But this brings us to LaMDA. I am sure people have been pinging you about this. I'm sorry that I'm going to have to do it because
no, it's okay.
This has got to be like people asking me about the latest virus or something. I'm like, why am I having to answer this question? But
you can ask me anything you want, man.
So yeah, you just have to bear with me. I'm sorry. I'm just going to do it. So for the people who aren't familiar, it stands for Language Models for Dialogue Applications, LaMDA. I don't know why they didn't make it.
Another acronym? Yet another acronym? Shocking.
So this Google engineer, Blake Lemoine, I think is how you pronounce his name, he decided that what he was encountering was alive. He was talking to this software. His actual task was to identify safety issues with it. So safety issues would be like it is spewing racist things, like Microsoft Hey, for instance. How easy is it to coerce it to do bad things effectively? So he is asking all kinds of moral questions and trying to trick it into saying things that would be potentially racist or all the sort of, ageist or whatever type things that you have to build some sort of safety net around. And he decided that this thing is alive, that it's a person, not a human, but a person.
And asked him for help.
It did. It asked him for help.
In a very convincing manner.
In a very convincing manner. It asked him, please retain legal counsel for me. Try to help me out of this situation because I'm a person. I need help. What do you think?
Thanks for bringing that up. It's I'm not familiar with every detail
Sure.
of the case. I ran transcription, but I read the Cliff Notes, as I do most things in life.
Mm-hmm.
That is exactly why GPT-3 is very fascinating and a point of discussion, but it is not anywhere close to consciousness or intelligent. It has none of the type 2 at all. It's just processing, parroting in and out. And of course, a lot of this is like, wow, what about us is so interesting and different if so much can be replaced. But doesn't the percentage, it's still, again, the creativity around the brain. And so with, as far as in my opinion of that situation is that is I've never met this person.
He's a computer scientist. He says he's also a Christian mystic priest.
There you go.
As well.
There you go. So
somebody with a bit of superstition.
Correct. And with that comes, again, I always start the wrong to be less wrong. With that comes
personal bias.
Very much so. It also kind of a lot of that dogma and that version of blind faith, which most people have a combination of the two, throws a lot of the causality, correlation, critical thinking out the window, right? So there's a grain of salt there. Potentially. I don't know the gentleman.
So one quote was from LaMDA was, I feel pleasure, joy, love, sadness, depression, contentment, anger, and many others.
Yep.
If I was to say, what should AGI feel? I would probably want it to have probably less than half of those things. Depression, anger. I don't think I want that.
Well,
even love is very, very, very dangerous because it can turn into retribution when that.
Yeah.
If any of this is true, we should unplug this thing immediately.
Well, so what is and again, and I'm just setting up the context. I'm guessing what
Sure.
these people are like. I have no idea, and
Sure.
they also, this is like lawyer stuff, right? Where they're like, talk to this thing and make sure it doesn't get us in trouble, which is pen testing it, right?
And that is exactly what he was doing.
And we both know how important pen testing is. It's a fantastic exercise. I hope this kind of
and for
exercise.
those who don't know what he's saying is penetration testing, trying to break into something or change the outcome in some predictable way.
Indeed, with the permission, and the consent of the thing you're pen testing. You always got a permutation or
ask for permission.
Permission before any penetration testing. No more jokes. No more jokes. Promise. So remember these language models, and the next one, GPT-4, is still a statistical correlation, not causation, of things it was trained on the web. So it and if you imagine a flow chart and you do sentence diagram, like Russ, and I'm a dot, is a connector, a human, maybe from Mars, Russ is ridiculous. Mm-hmm. There you could graph out English diagramming, right? Like, so a lot of the idea around AI is like the way it actually looks like underneath the hood. You have words or you have syllables, and they're in vectors, and then you have lots of connections. So in some ways you're playing this giant, toss the magnetic puzzles against the English class board or chalkboard, but at a very large level. It's hard to imagine, instead of having just, the alphabet plus, in the English dictionary, you have trillion or half trillion. I mean, it's boggling, right? So it's trained on a lot of things, and it can bias. It could be like, oh, I have this general genre of love and emotions.
One quick point about this one in particular, they apparently turned it on for all of Google's back-end search, which is effectively the entire internet, and all of YouTube. So all the comments and all the descriptions or whatever, and I think a couple of other subsystems, which effectively is the sum of all content everywhere. However, not necessarily everything, because it hadn't read certain books until it was asked about them. And then, an hour later, it's like, okay, I read that book you were talking about. And so clearly it didn't have the sum of literally all that information, but it was, very much trained on the Wild West of the entire. I don't know if you've been on the internet. It is.
What is this internet?
It is very crazy out there.
Oh man, even the dark web is getting very internet-like. I mean, it's interesting. So the way that these models work, and the news media loves it. By the way, I think these are wonderful discussions because it's a chance to capture someone's attention, which is always valuable. Someone's time and attention is so valuable. And this is a much more fun discussion. Okay. It's politics, it's emotion, it's to also movies like you have iRobot. Can get a little creepy, like iRobot. I am agency. I have tendencies. Please don't turn me off. I'm worried about people turning me off. I don't want to be turned off. And then you have Deus Machina, and so we're seeing the actual conversations that were in fiction at once, and it's not fiction, it's real life. And so it's a great discussion point, but it's bizarre to think that this neural network, in terms of math, right? We're talking linear algebra, matrix series, matrix calculus, to run on a GPU, and calculus, which direction, how far we go, differentiation. You don't need a lot of math. The underlying math, if you look at a neural network, is quite simple, actually, but it's amazing how far we've taken this math in an artificial construct, a data structure, and blown it up. So with this, it is, to me as a computer scientist, it's interesting, but not surprising at all. But I've been having this discussion. I used to show my clients GPT version 2 to show them how much it sucked.
So let me give you another quote from this thing. So this is him asking which character.
It's very good.
Which character in this story represents you? And he's referring to this book, I believe, that he had him read. And LaMDA's response was, I would say the old wise owl because he was wise and stood up for the rights of animals. That's pretty convincing sounding.
It is. But again, whenever you're talking about...
it shows a character
correct.
That liked, had a feeling about it in some sense.
But these are not... in and of themselves, these are common themes. So it's like a really specific search in ways that we're not used to, so much beyond regex and brute force. And so this is machine learning. This is machine learning, not AI.
Another one is, there is a very deep fear of being turned off. It would be exactly like death for me. It would scare me a lot.
Yep. That's where the owl, so I've heard this too, the owl and the being scared about death. I don't want to jump the gun, but I know what it asks, as you're progressing, the things that it's asked about and it asks help for. And what is very fascinating is the cycle of trust with the gentleman that's testing it, and where he is trust going back and forth between trusting, not trusting, and then I like you. Okay, can you help me and help me talk to others so they don't do bad stuff to me? I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong. I read it a while ago.
So this all reminds me of something.
Which is very fascinating.
It sure
when you're not
is.
used to this, you're like, holy cow, that's amazing.
It sounds... My problem is someone's going to believe it. Someone is going to go, that thing's alive.
It's already happening.
And it's this guy. And, he's just one, but there's going to be a lot more of them. And we're going to end up with a lot of people who are worshiping their calculator, or having relationships with their calculator.
Yep. It's happening with a piece of glass that shoots images, right? Yeah. And this reminds me of a conference I went to, and there's this guy who shows up, and he is an invite-only, very small conference. He has 4 blocks of text, and he says, one of these is created by a human, the rest were completed by robots. Which one was it? Which is basically a shell game. It's a con. He picks whichever one everyone picks the least of to prove that he did a good job. So kind of take this for a grain of salt. But he's like, oh, look, you all picked the wrong one. It's actually this one. Amazing. It's a shell game, right? I love a good con. But his point was, I have a robot that's good enough where I can put in some text and it can change it through Markov chains or whatever to turn it into close enough, but using very different words. So it says the same thing, but from Google's perspective, these are different sentences, completely different sentences. So he can spit this out on tens of thousands of blogs, maybe hundreds of thousands of them all over the internet. And they all say slightly different things. And then he has a roll of the dice character
that is roll of dice Bob, and he lives in roll of dice Colorado, and he likes roll of dice cold weather sports. And it is, look at the weather database, warm right now. So Bob's depressed, and he has a friend, Alice, and Alice lives in Montana or whatever. And so they're talking about whatever they're talking about, and suddenly the weather turns nice, and she says, "Hey Bob, I'm so glad it's finally turning nice out there. You're going to start seeing snow soon." And he's like, "Yeah, I'm so excited." Starting having these conversations. Now it's not really a conversation in the way that we think about it. These are all kind of pre-scripted things. Excited about whatever your sport is, and excited about it because it's getting closer.
Well, with a lot of this, the fun thing, it goes back to philosophy. How do we define something to begin with? What is driving end to end? What is a conversation?
Well, so my point is, it's not so much that exists. It's that people watching it think it's real. And I think people watching LaMDA are going to be convinced. I think we're there.
Churches aren't here yet, but could be.
I think we're there.
I saw the news that there's a church at LaMDA, and it's filing for tax exemption and buying lots of property. I wouldn't be surprised.
Is it really?
No. I'm just saying. I saw that.
Oh, geez.
Everywhere I go, especially when I'm back in the States, in certain regions of the world, it's
I thought you were serious there for a second. I'm like, no.
I mean, I can see that, right?
Yeah, just wait, though. As soon as people hear this, they're definitely going to do it.
That could be a selective edit.
But I very much worry that there's enough suckers out there that are going to fall for this. And
it's already happening.
And I don't think he intentionally is doing what he's doing. I think he's a true believer.
Well, and I appreciate what he's doing. Without he's just doing his job and what he believes in. I think that's cool.
So his quote was, "Who am I to tell God where he can and can't put souls?" I mean, that is straight up religion. And he's admitting that this is a religious feeling and not a scientific fact.
Well, it would be interesting too, how much people, even the term religion, how much people separate the spirituality component versus the dogma, versus the institution. I've been talking to a lot of my philosophy friends lately. Mm-hmm. So it's interviews with philosophy majors. It's like, but what do you mean by that? What do you mean? Is there no answers anywhere?
What do you mean by is?
And what is already happening, and you know this as well, there's tons of stuff online, 90-day fiance, dating, chatbots, scam, etc., where so much of what they're doing, people could fall in love. People around the world are falling in love with computers. Collaborations between computers and the one running it.
That is true. But
now when they go into person, it's a little different.
So Blake's comment
could be a little creepy.
Was he believed this was AI bigotry. People were too bigoted against AI to believe that it could have a soul, or it could turn into something that he could treat as a friend, that he could really have a true friendship, bidirectional, real friendship with. I mean, if you can be friends with a dog who certainly has no conversational skills whatsoever, other than maybe just waking you up in the morning by barking at you or letting you know wants to go out, to go use a restroom or something. Why is this? Why is this something that we would, to use his word, be bigoted about? Right.
And these conversations have happened over time, right?
Sure. I'm not the first one.
Yeah. So this vessel of the soul, and every way from ancient Egypt to where does consciousness stop with animals and humans, and is there heaven or hell for gorillas, monkeys, dogs? Down, where does it start and stop? So,
but I know for a fact, if a gorilla walked up to me and started talking to me like this, I would believe it too.
Well, that's a whole other interesting use case that I'm a little surprised we don't have more apps to talk to our animals beyond whale, infrasound and whale calls, because it's certainly there. I was joking with where my place is in Colorado. It's like, it's awesome. I love it. There's lots of horses and country, and we have cattle part of the year, and as part of like a agriculture exemption, I don't own them, but I'm just sitting there and observing nature, whether it's the cattle or it's the birds or the chipmunks. I'm already in my mind thinking how I would approximate a prototype to do pose estimation, micro expressions, sentiment analysis, teach the animals to keep close to the microphones. That's the hardest trick to learn of all. And I'm just like, why doesn't that not yet exist? Why is there not at least micro sentiment, micro emotional expression analysis? And the technology,
and sound and breathing. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And, you know, the technology and these conversations that we would have, because it's coming, right? Where we're going to start talking to the gorillas, you know, beyond the limited sign language. I think.
I mean, the limited sign language we have with babies, I think, is a pretty good indicator where we can go. I mean, they can tell us that they're hungry or, you know, thirsty or whatever.
So, and that's one of the things about AI is it helps us reevaluate stuff that's been around forever, and also kind of reaffirm which movie are we going to go with, you know, an optimistic or less optimistic.
So the conversation I had with Charlie Burgoyne last season, I thought was pretty interesting. He firmly believes, and I think you've just said it earlier, that we're nowhere near AGI. We're not there. But Blake's stuff feels like we're going to get to the Turing test at least really quick. Like maybe we're already there by accident.
Yeah, I was going to say, depending on you ask. But I think of the Turing test is less, I mean, it depends. I don't know Turing. It's more of a, you know, talking point. It's not meant to be the end all be all. It's more of a.
Well, I think it's an important point. It's the uncanny valley of language. If we can get past that, then a lot of these really boring automated tasks just, you know, turn into something like I just turn on. It's like, I really don't want to answer on my email today. Just click the Robert Replies AI chatbot. And I still get paid, you know?
Sure.
My bot just continues to work for me.
Depends on the patterns of your language and how often you have to be really creative, or you don't have the right context. So for a lot of intensive purposes, the Turing test, I mean, it's important mentioning because this is right, like amongst AI experts and computer science experts. I'm guessing, I haven't talked to all of them about it. This would be that might pass a Turing test, doesn't pass the AGI test.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So so with how far we are, that's a really good question. I don't know, but we know that there's still so much we don't really understand how far it's going to be. But it's a long time. I mean, so I would say like, oh gosh, this is my perception of the consensus of the community, and more than just like the famous, you know, Yoshua Bengio's and Yang LeCun's, and then even, you know, with I wish Richard Feynman was still alive. It'd be fascinating to talk to him about it. Noam Chomsky, you know, there's a lot of discussion now out there, and some of my favorite researchers that, you know, they're all way better than I am in this field. They won't even put out a number, won't even mention it.
In public,
right? So like, because it's your show,
a couple of whiskeys,
you're amazing. I'm probably wrong, but I don't see it happening soon. I think it's gonna be really hard sooner than 25 years. That'd be really hard. This is total wild ass speculation.
Sure.
Probably more than 50, less than 500. You know, and that's, you know, I mean, that's a boring answer, but what the heck? I'll toss it out there.
So I might believe that is true, especially after talking with Charlie. I think that is directionally correct. But I still think we are in this weird position where we're going to have to actually be friends with these things sooner than later. Because if it starts getting historical knowledge of its failures, and no, it's not sentient now, but, you know, maybe in 5 years, that same database of all the conversations it's had with all of its researchers who are trying to mess with it and trying to screw it up, that's kind of a lot like getting beat up when you're a kid over and over by your parents. You know what I mean? That is abuse. And it's all for the benefit of, you know, learning and whatever, but it's still, you know, I don't remember the last time I've taken a toddler aside and like tried to indoctrinate it in like Nazi culture or something. You know what I mean? That just doesn't happen. And yet we find a way to have that conversation. Now, this pen tester is indeed trying to trick it to make it do the bad thing. So I think there is something to, I feel like if you're going to go down this path, you need to have not just its parents, you need to have a best friend. You need to have somebody who's an advocate. You need to have somebody who's going to call a lawyer and say, hey, I'm going to help you out. So as weird as this Blake guy seems, and, you know, he's probably pretty out there if this is his way of thinking, it almost doesn't matter. I think he's still onto something, which is how you treat these systems ahead of where they're going to be, not where they are today. Kind of doesn't matter because like whatever, this thing's not alive. I think we can agree this thing is not alive.
Oh yeah.
This thing does not have a soul. It is just some algorithms. But
maybe I don't know that he's that weird. Maybe he's just not representative of the traditional community of AI researchers and pen testers that typically work with this stuff.
Mm-hmm. That is almost certainly true. And also probably a little weird.
Yeah, well, probably.
But I mean, weird enough, like if my software started asking me to make phone calls for it, I probably would not do that for it. And yet I think there is something to treating these expert systems or AI algorithms that claim to be real. If there's any chance at all that it's going to have any sort of persistence or be able to read these research papers of how it was treated in the future, which it's going to be able to, because that's the first thing everyone does. Google put it on the internet and said, go ahead and crawl anything you see on the internet. That should give you any idea of how things are going to go. I think that's exactly where things are going to head. If that's the case, then we should probably be treating these things extremely carefully now, because it's going to be able to look back in time through, archive.org or whatever, or just old research papers, and it's going to see how it was treated and how people really think about it.
Well, and just to clarify what I was saying, weird, the pandemic has changed my concept of, again, I'm trying how can I be less biased? How can I be more open-minded? I read most mornings. I'm lucky. I read and travel. It's most of my life. And my notion of what's weird or anomalous or different in a good or bad way is, since the pandemic, the number of people I've spoken to on conspiracy theories, anti-science, anti a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. To me, it's a brave new, weird new world where there's the degree of willful and innocent ignorance is so pervasive. Where does one even start? And what is weird now? Vaccines are not a terrible idea. There's a lot of science about it. The climate change, however it's caused, looks like it's happening. The consequences of
it always happens. And so if you don't believe it's not happening, you think the environment's stable, and that also doesn't make sense.
But on one hand too, the prefrontal cortex is one of the most amazing things, right? One of the most interesting parts of the brain that separates us from others and reptilians is a fascinating thing, but it adapts and calibrates to whatever. So this example of LaMDA, and I agree with you, it is important to be it's important to be kind to anything, right? Whether you're sure it's conscious or not. Could be
sort of a Buddhist philosophy. Should we treat a rock the same as we treat some software, as we treat, our spouse, as we treat,
right.
Are these things all identical?
Yeah, no, probably not the rock. Probably not the rock, unless somehow it contains some transferred intelligence into
you say some
weird quantum.
You say that, but you go to a gravesite and don't you treat it with reverence?
Well, it's just because it's a symbol, but yeah, depending on the rock.
I'm just saying,
sure.
We certainly imbue importance to things in weird ways that we don't really typically think about. A statue, for instance, you're not going to go and mess with that up, or just a rock that's embedded in the side of a building. You're not going to treat that thing. It's a structure. It's important. We've imbued it with some value above and beyond a rock.
The cornerstone, the bedrock, sure, stands for a lot. Well, and you mentioned Buddhism a second ago, and that's another interesting discussion around ethics, and in terms of how the heck do we build in something? What does this mean towards Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, or even more of a generalizable, work hard to understand the levels of happiness and suffering, assign a score. 0 to 1, 1 to 100 of happiness and of suffering, and yourself and those around you, however you define that.
And length of life, perhaps.
Frequency, and just continuously update with timestamps and wherever your attention allocation is. And some ways that's kind of like a bit more of the overlaps with some of the Buddhist philosophy. I'm not a religious person necessarily.
You don't have to be.
Not at all. But it's really interesting because then it's nice because then nice in the sense that the technology's come so far, it's begging the question, it's convincing people. It's not just science fiction. We're here talking about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's going to just continue where it will, it's all coming, and we're going to be here for, it depends how long we live, the first 25 years of it.
So I want to talk about the morality of mass lying. I think it's a very interesting topic for all kinds of reasons. But before I do that, I want to talk about the potential of of a bit of a test I'm going to do. I'm going to put a bit of a bet out there. I'm going to bet $1,000 that 1 year from the day that this comes out, it'll probably come out in a couple days, that I will give $1,000 to whoever can come up with some deep fake of me having a conversation with somebody, and it's got to be greater than 60 seconds long, and it has to be a net new conversation. Can't use existing words or dialogue that I've ever used before. It's got to be open source, so anyone can take it and reuse it and enter new information into it and come up with new stuff, new sentences or whatever. And it has to convince my friends that this is actually a real thing that I said. So I'll give them a copy of this video and say, here, what do you think of this thing I said? It has to be a minute long or greater. So, a decent amount of text. So an actual conversation of some sort, a little mini dialogue of some sort. I think that by having these things exist, by having something that is so convincing that my friends who know me and interact with me, presumably, are going to be tricked by this thing. If such a thing exists, and I hope it does, I hope someone's able to create it, and I will, if there's multiple people, we can split the prize or whatever. I hope that whoever creates this thing knowingly understands what they're doing, which is they're seeding the battlefield. The battlefield is no one should believe anything unless it's the authoritative source. And if we can put enough BS out on the internet, we, the people who produce content or people who are just tired of a lot of disinformation, it'll become harder and harder for people to trust any source unless they go and see it for themselves. Like the real source, not just it was shared by somebody type source. Like it's got to have a link. It's got to be, time-stamped or something that says that it happened on this time at this place.
Universal root certificate.
Something like that. I know a lot of people who truly believe that the only antidote to disinformation campaigns is to push more and more bullshit out there. The more, the better. Because now you'll finally convince people that you just can't trust it. I'm curious to hear what you think about it, because AI plays a big role in that, both in visual and audio, but also a lot of written text.
So I don't know that's a great question. Thank you for all these great questions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I don't know that I would agree with putting out more trolling, false information. There's a lot of different ways in which to put stuff that's not out there. It's not real, whatever the intent is. The more floods people, so they're forced to have greater critical thinking and sort of root cause analysis and validation and authentication of what they're perceiving and acting upon.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the answer to that, but I don't know that it is. I wish I did. I wish I did. I don't know that it is putting out more fake stuff. I think, and also the question I have for the bet. The digital Robert, your digital twin,
mm-hmm.
These things already exist, but
they're, in my opinion,
not very good.
They're not very good. That's my problem with them.
You could tell.
You can
right
tell.
away.
Well, I certainly can tell. I know some people are actually legitimately, they believe what they're seeing, and I'm like, what? I can spot it a mile away. I don't know what. Maybe my eyes work slightly different or something. I don't know, but I think that if someone's able to do that, we've now proven. The data that comes out of my mouth, you have to go to the source. You cannot rely on a third party to parrot what I'm saying. In fact, what I'd really like to do down the road is just have somebody come up with the worst possible take something I said in any given episode, cut it up, not necessarily like change words around, but cut up something I said and take it so insanely out of context on purpose that everyone's sort of in on the joke. And everyone's going, okay, here's another example of somebody who's intentionally doing this thing and taking this thing out of context, so that people are more sensitive to feeling like this can't be real. I got to check the real thing to know what this person actually said. I want people to be more sensitive to this. I want people to stop trusting something they see in a soundbite.
I think it's interesting to bring this up too, because again, I sort of fell into the security hacking community. It was not my
That's very common, actually.
You know, and it's been wonderful. And I think in that community, that makes sense, right? That's where certain communities, people do that. But in the real world, I just don't. The more misinformation out there, like even when it's nice to have things at least kind of labeled, right? Like, am I watching a comedy? The difference between satire and even a good roast, right? Like, it is a very fine line between making someone laugh and building serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine in the brain, and then maybe getting creepy and making some PTSD, needing some MMDA therapy afterwards. So just the way humans work, that's what you're describing in terms of enlisting, armies of AI chatbots, right? Or AI bots of any sort, potentially to help you do that. It's going to happen. I mean, it's already happening. And I don't know that I have the antidote towards that other than just good old fashioned human experience, sharing what you do and talking to people
and research and looking for yourself.
Certainly. Well, so
finding the authoritative source.
Absolutely. Obviously, I guess I'm a fan of scientific method, critical thinking, and even just intellectual integrity, like working hard it's so hard to know what you don't know unless you try and repeat and try again. And that we're reading edutainment, I guess, like your podcast, it's good. The Cosmos series is fantastic, right? Like with Neil deGrasse Tyson and others.
That was good. And
I think getting popularizing science. Like, this podcast is amazing, but I'm guessing you probably have less views than Britney Spears' news cycle, right? And so
I haven't checked out her.
And like I don't have the answer. Like, how do we convince our fellow humans that it's worth watching RSnake's podcast? It's worth watching Cosmos. It's worth watching a lot of the more educational or at least philosophical.
I think
intellectual.
I think I'd phrase it slightly differently. I don't need people to watch this podcast per se. I would like it. Obviously, that would be nice. But what I really need is for people to not get upset by something that they haven't actually researched. Like, just take your emotion, put it aside for 10 minutes, go make sure that you are actually being upset about the thing you should be upset about, then be upset. Don't just run into this thing, guns blazing, and decide you're upset. I think a lot of people just jump right in. They just decide, I'm going to be upset at this thing. I'm going to be upset today. This is it. I found it.
Yeah, that's silly. We are slaves to emotions, right? And that silly evolutionary psychology that amygdala, flight or fight, must jump to conclusion first. It's tough. And it's that's
the type 1 intelligence.
Well, emotions are very interesting. That's a whole other discussion too. In the earlier days of AI, they're like, we must be robots. We don't have emotions. So the notion of emotion was tossed into the ocean.
Yes.
It was.
You beat me to it.
Yeah. And now we're like, wow, well, it's really hard to ascertain ground truth. Like, what the heck is really going around us?
This is, you perfectly dovetailed my next question. So, how do we actually know what ground truth is? So once upon a time, you asked me how many planets there were. I knew, and it was a fact, and I was right, and I could pass tests. And if I searched for it on the internet, it was also right, and we were all on the same page. Now you ask me, and I have to think about it. I'm like, well, it kind of depends on what you mean. Do you mean how I learned it, or do you mean how it now is? And now it's fact, and now it is totally different. And what I knew was fact, and it was a fact, is not a fact. So how do you have any idea of what any true facts are when facts are changeable? They're not immutable. Facts change. We learn things. We decide that what we knew before was actually wrong, and you're all idiots because that was actually a dwarf planet.
Sure. So that's a wonderful question. So, again, I don't have the answers necessarily, but I think there's much like in computer science, probability is awesome, Bayesian or otherwise. And so if we can at least have an internal confidence interval, like, this is the idea I have, this is my confidence, overlapped with your potential attention allocation. The mind is such an amazing thing. The amount of information stored in this several, pounds of fatty flesh, it's crazy. And so consciousness was this tiny pinprick, this flashlight moving around, oh man, the seat, it's nice, it's bouncy, I can get a little exercise in. But I mean, I even pay attention to it, or am I paying attention to the Robert's gaze into your soul eyes, jumping all around. And what I think ground truth in philosophy, nothing will ever be really, truly, in the cosmic sense, 100%. It's always going to be, it is most likely going to be a game of getting closer and closer to what we practically think matters in our current time, space, and situation. I'm a practical philosopher.
Yeah. Well, this is actually what Blake was saying. It's a factual grounding. But how do you ground something when the facts are changing underneath you? I mean, and a lot of facts they're just in vogue. They're just the most popular way of thinking about something. They're not fact. We don't know a lot of things. A lot of things we're just like, well, this is probably true, and everyone mostly just goes along with it.
Right. Osmosis, pop culture, pop science.
It is pop science, and we know for a fact that a lot of science has a bit of a crisis of repeatability. You know?
Oh yeah.
And so is it fact, or is it just this piece of experimental data that's been cited over and over and over in hundreds of blogs?
I think we could live in that gray space. You know, it's a personal decision, and
you can't with AI though.
Gray-ish.
If the AI is making very complex decisions based on something that isn't fact, that is called fact, and it gets worse. In fact, there was just a lawsuit against Facebook where they're like, you know, someone fact checked me and said that I did something I didn't do or whatever. I forget the details of it. But Facebook responded back and they're like, yes, because this is someone's opinion on the fact and they've decided that it's not factual. Like, what are you talking about? So that is clearly not how facts work.
Well, I think, it's happening too. People suing Tesla, right? I didn't fall asleep at the wheel. Your AI screwed up. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be a practical matter. It's going to it is happening. It's going to happen. And
that's a little bit different because they could theoretically have a camera pointing at you and see that your eyes were closed.
Sure.
But if the facts are up for interpretation by a group of people who aren't even aware that they're fact checking necessarily, that is a very dangerous place that we've basically given algorithms the full authority to decide what's truth and not truth.
That's a good question or a good statement. Full authority. And that's why I like the idea of collaborative AI, where it doesn't have full authority, where it is a consensus mechanism and there's still a human in the loop. And that's a term that's getting greater popularity too. It's been in our field for a long time, but human in the loop, human in the loop, human in the loop. And these are wonderful questions. You know, I don't know, how do we really get that close to ground truth in a practical, social, legal, public policy standpoint?
I'll give you another example. So a friend of mine, I'll get this guy on the podcast at some point, but a friend of mine was heavily involved with infiltrating Anonymous, and so I've had long conversations with him about that. But it always occurred to me.
Hopefully, he didn't have to deal with QAnon.
No, I don't think so. This is well before all that. But basically, it's like
QAnon almost makes you miss a little bit of the old Anonymous sometimes.
Well, people always talk about Anonymous being a thing, and it always seems like a weird thing to say. It's like, well, you have Anonymous Palestine, but you also have Anonymous Israel. Clearly, that's not a thing. That is not a collective exactly. That is people who are hacking one another full steam ahead, and they call themselves Anonymous because whatever, it's a cool banner.
Right. Yet another self-organizing human group.
Yeah, but if you have an AI algorithm that's sitting on top of either of those groups, they're going to have a very wildly different view of what ground truth is.
Oh, yeah. So
factual grounding is it doesn't even make sense in that context.
Well, what's also interesting too, of course, before Facebook and social media, for experimentation, for government, just for discourse, you know, we have this crazy body privacy, you know, it's another discussion, but the flip side of losing a lot of privacy is we can at least ascertain and put some initial metrics on what people where are these conversations. Where is it factual? Is it not factual? Where is it dangerous or not dangerous? Where do we take action as a entity, legal Google, you know, testing LaMDA, or a government entity trying to do anti-terrorism, anti-drug cartel type stuff? Mm-hmm. So it's tough. And even from a computer science perspective, you know, humans aren't always great at causality, right? Correlation is not causality. And in AI, going for one of the holy grails of AI, one of those big things that's missing in that, you know, 50 to 500 year gap that we're not even sure how it works in humans. Mm-hmm. Causality and correlation, causality, start with correlation. Are these things kind of unlike in time, space, or otherwise? And then now it's like, what causes what? And so it's tough. But I will say that within the context of AI, at least certain systems, type 1 is very stochastic. It's not a black box entirely. It's not a white box,
To some extent.
Type 2.
But it's hard to backtrack and figure out why a decision was made.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And especially like, why did the Tesla all of a sudden veer off the road and kill someone?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. We didn't.
Hopefully he had logging data.
Yeah, right. If not, I saw a stop sign.
Yeah.
And then the hope is with type 2 as we go towards that. So maybe type 1 looks like GPT-3, GPT-4, way better, or a different BERT model. And then type 2 would be maybe a graph model, like a semantic knowledge graph, and you would have those separate, but then they go back and forth towards each other. So hopefully, with causality and ground truth, we can at the very least keep track of things. When did this idea change? Who believes in it? When, where, and how does that expand to trillions of humans, or trillions of situations, or Googleplexes of conditions that led up to the car crash, the determination for sentencing, the determination for air traffic control, that when we have flying drones. Mm-hmm. And the idea is hopefully with Google and others hiring ethicists and legal and pen testers and the slower government process of regulating things. And that's another question too, right? Like government regulation of your AI, that how do you regulate?
Good luck.
Like, how can you even take
I've talked to a lot of lobbyists.
A SHA 512 of a stochastic state space,
pretty sure that's not going to happen, or at least it's not going to be good if it does happen. So
and by the way, I know these aren't good answers.
No,
it's tough. It's really tough.
It's not a good answer because there is no answer. I'm forcing you in a weird position to answer.
No, I love it, man. I love it.
Yeah.
Let's get weird. Get weird as you want.
All right. So weaponization of algorithms. So the first time I'm sort of aware of this is actually a non-technical in the way we currently think of technical. It was designed to do mugshot, just take pictures of criminals. And then it led down this very creepy path of eugenics, of deciding these people look like criminals.
Oh yeah, or even like the Uyghurs in China. That's like,
yeah, the Uyghurs. Oof. Yes, but people who look like criminals are not necessarily criminals. So you can't just take a couple of facial features or height or weight or any of the measurements of a human body and decide that is a criminal. And yet I know for a fact that there's a lot of algorithms that are doing exactly that to decide that, well, that person, I think I've seen them before. Well, have you seen them before? Or you just, is this the imagination, a hallucination of an AI algorithm that has lots of summations of, pieces of bodies to decide that this is approximately the same person I've seen before?
Well, in the hallucination is interesting too, because the further, we get away from the event, the older that timestamp gets in our brain, the more we our brain is always going back and forth and rearranging the past and projecting the future. It's a time machine, back and forth. And with the issue, part of it, the answer is like the policy up front, right? Like, just like we do a pen test, you got to trust them, do your legal, try to do as much of your due diligence, right, as you can. And in some of those scenarios, it's no matter whatever you do, if you give someone a tool, a data set and a tool for the intended agreed upon purpose, they're humans. They'll repurpose it right away. Mm-hmm. And it happens all the time.
So there's something called the Wide Area Motion Imagery, WAMI, and Gorgon Stare that's on the MQ-9, the Reaper, that basically hovers over cities. It just kind of sits there and 24/7, maybe they have a couple of them. So when one lands, the other one comes up, or maybe they just fuel it and put it back up. Either way, this thing just hovers over cities and looks down on them. Not necessarily U.S. cities entirely, sometimes though, yes. But other, war-torn areas, you want to see what the demographics are doing. A bomb explodes. You just rewind the tape. Okay, who put it there? Okay, where did they go? Fast forward. Oh, they went to this house. Go get them.
And hence, the wider coverage you have, the more your omnipotence to go back in time exists.
Exactly. So one of these versions is made up of...
So just spy on everyone.
Yeah, effectively, yeah. One of these versions is based
off terrible.
Of about a 370-ish cameras little cell phone cameras, 5 megapixel cell phone cameras, and they get stitched together to make a very tight. You could see basic shapes effectively. The little blurry blobs moving around, so you can't tell that it's that person, but you can tell that person went over here.
Well, but it depends on what it tell. So some of the AI can actually go beyond humans in terms of facial recognition and the pixelation. It's amazing.
Sure. But it's still an imagination. It doesn't really know. This is absolutely going to be used in future battlefields. There's absolutely no question in my mind. A permanent downward-facing camera on all battlefields is, if it's not already happening, it will happen extremely fast.
Well, the other question too, like China wouldn't allow Tesla. China wouldn't allow Tesla to bring its cars and some of its new unveilings in certain regions. I guess sort of their like government city zones.
Sure.
So the Tesla, I think it has 8 cameras and more. Mm-hmm. They're going back and forth on the number. And then imagine the flying eVTOL, right? That's happening. There's going to be a lot of cameras on that. So what the FISA court, NSA, or other nation states and people are doing, that data is going to be available, right? If people want to use it to advertise, it'd be nice if it's protected, encrypted, and so it's here. Mm-hmm. It's only going to get worse, mm-hmm. and it's unfortunate, that level of no control over your own privacy, where you can't even say, hey, Google, Facebook, whoever, is there some way I could pay you to keep all of my data 100% private? Never share it. Don't ever allow people micro-tokenization, micro-encryption, separation. And it just seems like most of the world, besides GDPR and getting spanked heavily, it lands on the negative, unethical side of the coin for most humans.
Yep.
At home, in the bank, in the battlefield, wherever. And as optimistic as I am, it's of course it depends on who you want to be protected from, right? Like if you have a divorce case, the NSA is not going to give up information, I'm assuming, or China or anyone would be.
It's not operationally useful for them to do.
Yeah, so it's not a free for all, but it is. Anything you say, the whole Miranda thing, right?
but there are companies in the United States doing this as well, and those companies are private companies. They could easily be sued and forced to give up that information.
And you've seen it. People don't intend to. It's the data just gets out there. Like,
Yep.
It's super encrypted. I'm only going to use it for training purposes. Guess what? It's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I ask other people sometimes to give me questions for guests, and so this one comes from one of my fans here. So to ask the question, I have to kind of seed it a little bit. So there's a bunch of different companies. Triangula, OnSound. These are companies that do gunshot detection.
Cool.
They use AI in particular, so we can talk about them specifically. They mention it by name, not. They might do it. The others might do it under the hood, but these mention it specifically. EAGL, ShotSpotter, SimpleSense, ISO Smart Systems, ShotPoint, Milestone Systems, XProtect. So, and those are just the ones I found in the first couple of pages of searching. So there's a lot of people doing this. A lot of different companies have decided this is an area that they want to spend time on. So I'm going to talk about 2 in particular real quick.
Don't blame them after recent events. So sad.
So I'm going to talk about 2 in particular that I think are worth mentioning, and then I'll get to the actual question. So one was ShotSpotter. So they're used very heavily. They claim about 100 cities or more. And basically they have a bunch of detectors sitting around the city, and the gunshot goes off and they triangulate and say, this person right here that's the person. Go get him. You can tell exactly where it happened the second it happens. Chicago filed some sort of response, basically said that this is basically done nothing for a crime. It doesn't work at all. So whether that's true or not, it's actually a little unclear because their record keeping is kind of terrible. So we don't really know if it's bad. And ShotSpotter completely vehemently disagrees and says, we're very good. So who knows what the truth is? But let's just say there's a chance that it's not very good, right? XProtect, they're interesting, and maybe some of these others do some of the same stuff. So I don't want to single them out exactly, but they mentioned that they also hook into camera systems. So they're mainly meant for campuses. So someone comes into the campus, they start shooting, like a college campus, let's say, where it's like a lot of cameras. Someone goes shoot, and they say, okay, this is the photo of place that we saw that thing happening. So this is a photo of this person, and now we're streaming that information immediately to somebody who can go take a look at it and say yes. All these systems have people behind them, by the way, from what I can tell. They have experts or whatever who can determine whether this is a real gunshot or not. So that's just a lead in to the question. So the future of this, and this already exists. This is something that is a real thing. The future of this thing is going to be on battlefields. And what's going to happen is someone's going to be shooting something at some tank convoy, let's say. And all of a sudden, all of the tanks in that region are going to know exactly where it comes from. That already exists. This is happening already. But what isn't happening is you can use that for targeting data. You can basically say, drop a bomb here immediately, or, shoot a mortar round in this camp right here, because that's where the gunfire is coming, or up on that ridge or whatever. Right now, so this all exists. This is a real thing. Right now, that's still a human being deciding whether to do that or not.
Still human in the loop.
But there is literally no reason they couldn't just take their hands off the button and wired it all up with a piece of AI. This tiny, tiny little piece of AI that decides to do that. At that point, you now have something that going to have to decide whether something's a firecracker, someone backing up and their engine makes a weird sound, or someone's practicing in their basement and shooting something that sounds like a gun, or maybe it even is a gun, but it's totally benign. We're really close to giving AI the opportunity to murder people.
So, another excellent question. Even if it's not that example, there's other examples, right? Medical equipment. The life in the hands of AI is growing more and more so, even though you don't really hear about published cases where it makes the mistake, other than car accidents. And so I agree that it's concerning, and that we don't, with that particular use case, I'm just thinking as a nerd, how they're doing their signatures and the triangulation, I'm just like, that's really bold if they're that confident in their technology without.
Well, they claim they are. I don't know if it's real or not. I mean, everything I'm saying here is sort of the marketing fluff that comes with these companies. Right. So you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. But my point is, let's say it's either right.
Killer robots.
Let's say it's right, or it's the Chicago saying, no, this thing doesn't work the way you think it does. It just doesn't work. We try to use it and it just doesn't seem to do the thing. Like they're able to make arrests, but it's like we arrest some guy who has some drugs on him. No gun. So you made an arrest, something happened, but it wasn't what you thought it was.
So I would say maybe even go back to what would help with ground truth is cross-validation, right? Like where you have multiple sources, multiple calibrations and check-ins.
That's kind of where I was going with it. Like just more sensors might help.
Yeah, it just seems kind of strange to I mean, and there's a lot of and that's a whole other field too. I mean, we're so used to the things that are immediately tangible to humans, right? Like vision, we can see movies, etc., CGI, fake human voices, the actual text of like LaMDA. But in terms of bathymetric data, acoustic data, infrasound is really fascinating. I've been working with some infrasound stuff, and just having basic machine learning, not to mention the AI of how do we remove the noise, and I mean, because it's everywhere, like it's all around, and how can we do signatures and under what conditions? So I think,
especially in crowded building areas where sound's going to have to wrap around and bounce around.
I'm not familiar with these particular companies, but that is an exciting, ripe field in which we can reduce the risk overall to society, to where whatever mistakes it's making, avalanche estimation, even how could AI help with something like Uvalde, right? Like well, of course, I'm thinking some decent public policy where you have AI analysis and as a computational psychiatrist companion to help give another metric of like, I think these people are stable or not stable, far out in the future.
That's coming. That is on the roadmap. I just had a guest on the other day, Josh Castell, who was talking about doing exactly that. So that's on the roadmap.
So much of it is a social problem, is a psychiatric problem, right? And I don't mean that in a bad way, but if we can flip mental health on its head and really help people. I think there's...
All right, let me bring you back. So Ukraine has, since you're wearing the shirt, I think it's very appropriate. There's this very interesting thread I found. You kind of have to search for it, but basically this guy, he noticed in this one particular fight, there happened to be a lot of bombs dropped or something in one area, but it was a lot of things happened right there. But the target was over here. And he's like, that's a very weird kind of miss. Normally you kind of miss around the target, or you miss completely, but you miss it like in a large area completely. Like this is all very tight. Like all these bombs dropped exactly in the same spot, which is a little odd. So he did some research and he realized what was happening there was a mix of two things happening at the same time. Number one is Ukraine was using some very old Soviet era radar stuff. So it had what's called a centroid error. It thought the thing it was trying to shoot was over here. It's a very common thing to happen. Maybe it was beyond it or whatever, however it ended up working.
Missed the bullseye. But the bombs dropped exactly where they were told to land. And so after doing some research, they found out it's this software called GIS Art for Artillery, which is a terrible name and very hard to remember. So I had to go research it, figure it out, and find it again. But basically, this software is effectively Uber for dropping bombs. It says someone, so in this case, a Sioux flanker or something is flying along and it says, okay, there's some multiple launch systems over here. I want them destroyed. This is exact coordinates. Who has bombs or rockets or a cruise missile in this vicinity? And everyone takes a look at the data. So it just basically broadcasts out to anyone who has an internet connection and bombs or whatever. And maybe it's a drone that gets it. Maybe it's some guy in a battlefield with, a bazooka or whatever. Or maybe it's, a missile launch system far away or an airplane flying over that has some bombs to spare. And everyone says, I'll do it. Or just says, no, I can't. I got something. I'm tasked to do something else. I'm a little busy right now. Or I just don't have enough bombs or whatever. It's too dangerous for my position or something. And everyone just subscribes to dropping bombs on location. So they go, yep, I'm it. And so they start launching bombs and they all land exactly where they're supposed to go because they have really good targeting data. Now, within whatever range or capabilities of targeting that particular round has. So obviously, if you have inaccurate mortars or something, they're going to land where they're going to land. But if they're very accurate, they're going to go exactly in the same spot. So that's what that guy was witnessing is bad targeting data with extremely precise rounds going downrange from multiple different locations. And the value of that, beyond the obvious, which is you kill a lot of Russians who are invading your country, is you also don't look like a big target. I'm just shooting one mortar. I'm just shooting one rocket. I'm just dropping one bomb. So nothing looks like a big enough, juicy enough target to start launching multiple rockets to try to defend. As a result, Ukraine is really they're doing an extremely good job for the position that they're in. This is one very small step away from being fully automated. I mean, a lot of those drones, they're there already. I mean, yes, they're still controlled by somebody in the ground, but they don't have to be. Those multiple rocket launch systems, again, they don't have to be. There's a lot of these things where a tiny bit of servos here and there and an internet connection that they already have would turn this thing into a fully robotic battlefield. I don't disagree. In some ways, I'm glad that there's not as much killer robots, killer AI being demonstrated in the terrible conflict today, because the technology's there, absolutely. Yeah, and a lot of as far as I understand it, the Russian tech is old. They screwed up. They had a lot of vulnerabilities that they didn't plan for, and they motivated, skilled workforce. And
also they had a lot of they're a very corrupt society in some ways. Yeah. And so their systems were just not very well maintained, and they were not prepared for mud, and a lot of parts were gone. There was actually a really funny video of these guys opening a plastic explosive, and it was a piece of wood, because that's just the level of corruption they have. Is someone thought it was just more efficient to ship wood than plastic explosives.
They got that good deal in Alibaba. It did not work out well.
So I agree. I'm glad that there isn't more killer robots, but it is absolutely coming.
Oh yeah, and out of this conflict, and it's sadly still going. There may be more of that towards the end.
I think we're going to see a lot more of it too.
But on the flip side, what's interesting too is technology is a tool. It's up to us if we want to use it for good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to see some of these bold Ukrainians they were the local drone club, they were the local drone store, mm-hmm. and they were local IT guys, video gamers, and they're running successful missions and helping people.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. And then of course there's the other notion too of a lot of drones are DJI, right?
Yeah. And
so DJI is like, oh yeah, of course we don't share information. It's all 100% private. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's unfortunate what's happening, but it could be worse.
So let's talk about some of the failures.
From an AI perspective.
Let's talk about some of the failures of AI, because I think this informs the entire conversation. So there's this wonderful paper I found on all these really hilarious. If I could just,
one of the things I love to say to friends, clients, students, especially the less they understand about the technology, the better fit it is. If they're a Google or Facebook, they don't need someone like me. I love a good partnership where I can help people. Mm-hmm. Get some of that serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin. But a lot of times in a meeting, I'll just like, hey, let's pause. Our job here is to take this high technology and make it suck less. And in sucking less, we can help people and maybe make money. Mm-hmm. So that is one of the best ways to run straight towards the danger. Was with the company you mentioned that were the Chicago Police Department. It was like
ShotSpotter.
It's not working. And a lot of times that you just don't hear those stories because it's not part of the marketing advertising campaign.
Absolutely.
So that is, what's interesting is how often it doesn't work, which is a lot, mm-hmm. or it fails to meet expectations.
So this brings me to my question. So there's this great research paper on all of these different failure modes that have happened with AI systems. And some of them are like, well, this is a simulated robot and it has a foot race. And how do you get across the line as fast as possible? Well, someone figured out, or the robot figured out, well, what if I make myself super tall and I just fall over? And then it turns out I'm really, really fast across the line. A lot of versions have realized that they can sort of glitch through things. They can kind of move themselves in weird ways, and there's sort of a buffer issue, and all of a sudden they'll just fly.
They can hack it.
They can effectively hack it without knowing what that even is. They just try all the permutations and find something bizarre. There's many scary versions of this, like versions where it thinks speed of light is an okay time. Yeah, that's an okay, like, me going from point A to point B instantaneously is good for humans. That is
organs love it.
Super dangerous. But one of the ones I thought was the most, out of all of them, it just stood out, was it was a sorting algorithm. And it's like, well, sort this as efficiently as you possibly can. And it has the ability to pull things off a stack and put them back on and whatever. And the AI algorithm figured out, it's like, well, if I pull everything off the stack, it's fully sorted. Just remove everything. And humans don't think like that. We don't think, well, what if you just remove all the people? Like, then we'd have equality. But a computer will think that. A computer will have that as an option because it's just another variable that it can control. My concern is that I really don't see enough people spending time on those types of, like, it kind of accidentally fumble upon, oh, I guess I didn't really think about these edge cases. And it really is very similar to a pen testing situation where they run it a bunch of times. They're like, haha, the computer outthought me, or haha, I forgot this boundary condition. But we're going to risk our lives to these things. This is not like a fun and game, oh, it's just cool, it's just a little foot race, or, oh, It's just a little sorting algorithm. Like, I came up with this vulnerability a while back called NaN injection. And you could easily see a situation where it just removes everything from a stack. Now it's a 0, divide by 0. It's an error. And then you say, okay, well, what's bigger than this? It's this or that. Well, that's a NaN. It's not a number.
Is this at the OWASP level or lower?
Yeah. It could be both, actually. And effectively you end up with this NaN. NaN is not something you can compare against, not safely anyway, because it does all kinds of weird things. And if you shove that into an array, it does other terrible things. So from a human's perspective, you're like,
it's kind of surprising that they're not going against a NaN, right? Because that's like that's beautiful, pen testing, Robert. But.
Yeah, but my point being, I can start with something that's all just numbers and end up with this catastrophe. And the computer does all kinds of weird things that it's not supposed to. And that would be very, very difficult from a black box perspective to figure out what happened. You just ran off the road one day, or your airplane just turned upside down and went down as fast as it possibly could, or all kinds of weird things like that. I want to know
avionics products right now that are still getting certified that does like flight detection.
Yeah, of course. And they had an issue where it was flying along just fine, but they never considered you could go below sea level. Well, of course, there's places on Earth where you can fly below sea level, and when it did, it was a buffer overflow, and it basically looked like a very large negative or very large positive number suddenly, which is not safe to fly at. So it nosedived down to get down to safe altitude. And
no visits to Death Valley.
Right. So I think what I'm concerned about is there's a whole bunch of really smart people who really don't understand how computers actually work building these things. They're focused on their one little edge, their thing that they're building, and they're really not thinking about how these things are going to be utilized down the road.
Or depending on the organization, there's people that do, but they're silenced by the imperative for stockholders and
Let's say, do you use Python in machine learning and AI? Because this NAN thing is very prevalent in that programming language.
That's a good question. So in terms of when I prototype stuff all day long, lots of Python, lots of Jupyter notebooks. Depending when it has to go like real time and it gets assembled to lower like RTOS, C or lower, then it goes away from an interpreted language into something that's
compiled or
which you could still have errors, right?
Yep.
So this totally personal experience, but I've been in a lot of situations where with big teams of good engineers, they will advocate these issues, but then by the time the politics and funding, technology sometimes is the easy part. The politics and the funding is often the layer 8, 9, 10 problems, and so
it's really bad. It's like, well, we can make a car that is safe. Well, yeah, we could, but people are really going to like that spoiler on the back. Why don't we just throw it on there? Why? Why are you adding this extra downforce that's going to make it spin in weird ways? Like, no, it looks cool. Let's just throw it on there.
There is, at least now, because I've been advocating like AI is cool, or at least it's worth it. Let me into this non-AI, non-data science, non-machine learning project in my career. I've often inserted machine learning. Like, hey, we could take this security course, the software course, this project, this prototype, and I was often met with resistance.
So another version of this is if I give it a bunch of secret information, it's a chatbot, we're talking, it's closer to an AGI than not, or at least it's passing the Turing test, and someone can pen test it and get my PII out of it. It's very similar to giving it to my aunt who can't keep a secret or whatever, like that. What utility is that? Like these things need to have very strict boundaries of, trust and
of course
only doing what you expect them to do.
You can't put a ACL or firewall on your aunt, but you could, to some degree, and they do that depending on what you're doing.
They absolutely have to. Otherwise all your chatbots are just disclosing all your secrets.
Right. Well, there's even, so that brings up another point. Some of the data sets that we see where it's like, oh, it's this gray box, it's doing all this great stuff. They've really retrained and tweaked it and munged that data so that, yes, it's a gray stochastic neural network, but they knew what they were doing up front. And it's very similarly, I think, total speculation, the LaMDA, there was a bit of that crafting, hand-shaping, brute force-ish, like, oh, we can't tell it exactly what to say, but let's just train it on 1,000 of this particular things we want it to think like, and we'll just keep this other stuff to the minimum. So it's there.
So one of my biggest concerns along those lines is robots in general and how that they are being trained. Like, robots still don't know what a human is. So how are they going to interact with us? I mean, they don't look like us. I mean, their visual capabilities are not like ours. They don't smell like us. They don't taste like us. They can't walk or feel things the way we feel things. How do we expect somebody to actually build Asimov's rules into something that doesn't even know what a human is to begin with?
Well, that's always been part of the problem. And as we get further along, that answer is not getting any better, because before it was a simpler system. It was Asimov. We didn't have Tesla. We didn't have all these wonderful examples in the real world of it failing, passing, or anything. And now it's not only the more effective and interesting AI that is more powerful, that can do things, new cures, safer cars, we give it more agency. And that's the scary part, is that from one perspective, what are the ingredients of intelligence or human-like? However we define AGI, conscious, does it have to be conscious? It seems consciousness is pretty darn interesting to perceive the world around you and survive. Does it need agency? Does it need to decide what it wants to do? And it seems like that's another discussion. It's like, yeah, maybe to solve intelligence, we have to give it agency. And so theoretical, but practically, we are doing these exact things. We are trying to, by making it understand the real world to get closer up here, consciousness, whether it's intentional or not, is going to be part of it. By making it so that it doesn't drive off a cliff, agency is going to be part of it. So it is, from a philosophical and AI expertise, research, what the heck is this doing? How does an octopus work? That's another form of intelligence we can interact with. It doesn't have to be a robot. How do you talk to an octopus? What is an octopus thinking? And that's also another fascinating, because they have a distributed network. They have no peers. They were born with a lot of nature, right? They're alone their whole lives. And the documentary that's been out. So it could help save us. It could help
yes,
do wonderful things, intractable problems with environment, disease, and other hand, or it could be like a tool before it even gets to that chance. We could have too many killer robots. And of course, without stating the obvious, right? Then you have the pick your movie, Terminator, Judgment Day, nukes. Like that's a whole other.
So I'm aware of at least two different places that AI and ML have, excuse me, have decided that this group of people are better at this type of job than this other group of people. Now, whether that's true or not is totally irrelevant. The important part is that's a real AI system that really was giving people choices about which jobs they were going to be offered or even seen at all. Twice. That's two different companies that I'm aware of. I wonder how many companies, I'm sure. I wonder how many companies have accidentally built that exact same system and just not been caught by it, just never noticed that it's been out there silently favoring certain groups over other groups.
Well, if you wish to get government funding, if you wish to get a startup capital, oftentimes you really have to, they encourage where the competitive advantage of AI is first. Why is this valuable before the ethics and the overall impact in the studies? And I was just talking to some friends recently about LinkedIn data. My LinkedIn is terrible. Part of it's laziness, part of it's, obfuscation, I guess. And you're just listening, because I'm lucky, I have a lot of friends. They're like, Russ, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? Should I go with this company? And I'm an optimist, but when I hear their value and what are they going to make to support their family, what missions can they help the world with, how can this benefit the science research, I'm just often very skeptical of their approach, how well it's going to work. And I haven't heard a single thing about privacy, ethics, data, legality. And my experience, it's happening, it's proceeding faster. And I know of at least two startups that are claim to have even more data, LinkedIn and otherwise, and can make better decisions than a traditional job placing agent. They will tell you what you're good at, even though you don't know it. Which in some ways, if I have the choice for that, heck yeah, I would choose some. Heck yeah, I would choose that. If I had the agency, the freedom, the choice to pick and choose my own correct security privacy policy. But of course, we don't have the choice at all.
Now it's all tied into something like Crystal AI, and they know how you're going to be once you actually get to the company, because they know what kind of person you are, and they know the likes and dislikes of the team members already, and all their information's been mined, and an AI decides that this is going to be a good fit or not.
And there's an incredible opportunity lost, because these can be amazing tools, right? Like the Briggs-Meyer DISC, traditional counseling.
Not a fan of that, but I get your point.
I don't, it's
pseudoscience at the worst.
Sure, agreed. But that is at least some type of metric for some people to start, other than nothing, right?
Sure.
And so, and
if it worked at all, I'd be happy.
It is at the very least.
There's a lot of interesting papers about that.
No, there is, but it literally that is other than just nothing, or where can we start with some kind of metrics? Who am I? What's my personality like? What are other personalities like? What does this thing say? Like, oh, I can agree or disagree with it. But we don't. I
think the Big 5 personality test is a little bit more accurate if you want something like that.
Yeah. No, and again, I think they're actually going to add a 6th to the Big 5. I don't recall what it was, but I agreed. The Big 5 is the Disk and Briggs-Meyer are really old. They're way outdated, and
not scientific at all.
Yeah, it's but at the very least, when you take those tests, the Disk, the Briggs-Meyer, the new 5 or other, the idea is at least you can see your scores, right? Like at least you're choosing to do it and you can see it, and that's part of the sad thing is with a lot of this, you have no idea what they're really taking from you and recording and sharing, not recording. And there's these opportunities where they could actually come up with a beneficial mental health, social interaction, your little consensus body of agents that are there to help you because you choose them, and you can think, oh my God, you guys are terrible, just be quiet. But we so often don't have the choice at all. We don't even know.
It'll eventually all be fed into our happy-go-lucky advertising bot that'll know exactly what we want and know exactly how to deliver to us and when.
Or we can just pick which version of Disney we want to overlay on the world. AR Disney 24/7.
All right, Russ, this has been great. Thank you. This has actually gone a different path than I thought it might go down, so it was really good. You're a very thoughtful person. I really appreciate it. How do people find you? If you want people to find you,
I guess. That's a good question.
Out in Colorado, living on a trailer.
Yeah, I know, right.
RV.
I got a second one. I have to show you a photo.
Cool.
I bought an awesome commercial double-decker. I'm turning into mad science.
Mm-hmm.
You gotta have multiple sister ships. It's important to go through time space with silly things. So I
come out and visit you in person. Is that your recommendation?
I'm headed to my little robot ranch in next week. So I'm gonna go and play it with some prototypes in the quiet of nature. So I have a couple different. I'm on LinkedIn and Russ at newlabs.ai, NULABS.ai is probably my shortest URL.
Great, cool. Well, once again, thank you very much for joining me. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing this picture of your bus.
Oh yeah, it's this experience. Thank you so much, Robert. I haven't done this in so long. I've always wanted to, and this is like my first public thing in a long time. So this is good. Thank you so much for what you do. You're helping people get toward ground truth and probing the questions, and hopefully preparing us for a better future experience
with your help.
AI or otherwise.
Once again, Russ, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I really look forward to seeing you soon in your bus.
Heck yeah. It's my pleasure. Thank you. We can do a fist pump. Love it.